Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalam. Ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Amma ba'd. Ahabati fillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome. As a part of the symposium on supremacy and race, sponsored by the 5-2 Initiative, I was asked to present a talk about Black supremacy as a reaction to white supremacy and discuss whether it is retaliatory and discern whether it is offensive or defensive. Before beginning the discussion, I just wanted to lay down, if you will, the rules of engagement, in that if there are questions that I ask that we postpone them to the end, because actually I want this to have a element of interaction. So as I mentioned, as a part of this symposium, the symposium on supremacy and race sponsored by the 5-2 Initiative, I was asked to present a talk about Black supremacy as a reaction to white supremacy and discuss whether it is retaliatory and discern whether it is offensive or defensive. We'll try to keep this presentation as short as possible, leaving time at the end for questions or hopefully some discussion or engagement. So during the preliminary preparation for this topic, I found that there were many nuances pertaining to the subject and subsidiary issues that also have great relevance and import regarding the contemporary crisis of race that we are now beginning to discuss and address on the international stage. This debate has also forced Muslims to the table of discussion. So from the Muslim perspective, we have primarily two issues that we are confronted with: concepts of justice in the larger world community that we are intrinsically a part of, and figuring out our role and whether we should engage as Muslim minorities in secular societies, and to what extent. Secondly, we are also confronted with how to address the internal racial divisions and concepts of supremacy that we deal with on a daily basis amongst Muslims, and how to begin the uncomfortable discussion and find a path to healing internally. Unfortunately, all of these topics require far more discussion, research, and insight than the time frame I have been allotted. However, I will do the best that I can to at least touch on some of these themes. So first, we require context and definition of terms in beginning our discussion. And the reason for that, of course, in any research, in any type of academic endeavor, or in fact, any knowledge-based discussion, whether that's Islamically or a topic outside, in the secular fields, if you will, that you need a definition of terms. You need to know terminologies, places that you can reference back. And I'll give you an example of why that's so important. Just recently, and I made a video about this in response to an individual who was claiming about this lecture, had some claims, some false claims, saying that I was almost promoting Black supremacy or something, all kind of strange concepts just from the title. So this individual didn't listen because I didn't have anything to say. Now we're doing the lecture. So they had already, because of their misconceptions, because of their predisposition with regards to these concepts of race and these issues of racism, that they had already made up their mind and were already had already drawn conclusion, and that was just from the title. So it shows you how dangerous it is when we don't operate with common definitions, or at least we have some definitions for the terminologies and the things that we're discussing. So first, the first term that is so imperative for us to understand is the term racism. Okay, so racism is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership to a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. Look at that definition. So this is a working definition. This is the definition that I've more or less understood racism to be. So it's a type of prejudice, it's a type of discrimination, and antagonism. So, it's aggressive, it's proactive against a person or a group of people due to their race or ethnic group. And typically, doesn't mean in all cases, but typically it is from a minority, or it is inflicted upon minorities. Meaning usually, for example, in the concept, and I know a lot of people have a difficult time with this, I don't say that African Americans can't be racist in American society. No, that's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is typically when we talk about racism, because the power is a white power-based system, the whole structure of the society, and we're going to talk briefly about that when we get to it, is based on white supremacy. Okay, it's based on an ideology. We're going to define for what we mean by white supremacy too. All of these terms, we need to have good working definitions before we even get into the topic. So it's important that is a power structure. So when the one who is a minority, who is very small, insignificant in the sense of numbers and power, has a type of discrimination, it's usually rare, and it doesn't have as much import. It's very different when you go to the court and you're not allowed to go into the court because of your race. The judge is an active Klan member. The sheriff who brought you to the court has a little bit of love for law, but he wanted to give you to the people who gathered outside the court to lynch you just for your race. You could have been totally innocent of whatever crime, and the crime could have been simply just looking at someone of the opposite race in a wrong way, or especially the opposite sex. These are very real scenarios, and throughout the history of the African American here in America. So racism, as we said, that there's a power element in general to it. Doesn't mean in all cases, but generally there's a power. If you're in a small society, a microcosm, for example, you go to a high school and it's mainly black, and you are a white female or a white male or what have you, and you find discrimination, that's also racism. And that's in the microcosm. But in the scale of American history, in the larger scale, it is minute, and those scenarios are few and far in between compared to the overall picture of white supremacy in America and racism that is inflicted on African Americans. And we're going to talk about that shortly. So also, racism can be defined as the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics. So also, just for the sake of clarification, wa alaikum salam, I'd prefer if we leave comments to the end. I'm going to try to go through the material, and then we will, I'll leave time for discussion if anybody has comments, because I prefer, and I can learn from you, and we can learn more from engaging instead of you just listening to me. I think that's more productive. So we're going to get through this, and I prefer if we don't have any comments and questions until the end, bi'idhnillah ta'ala. So also, racism can be defined as the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities, especially so as to distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another. That's also a very big part of racism, is that there's a concept of superiority and inferiority. So, for example, if you are if you're Pakistani, and in your family, what they say about some other people. Maybe they have a racism towards Indians. They say, and they have certain slang and certain language they use, and they're elders. Okay, as our brother Imran was mentioning, Dawah man, may Allah preserve him, when he was talking about how he grew up, with the Pakistani-Indian rivalry, which is an element of nationalism, racism. I don't know if we there is an element of racism, but anyway, it's those same kind of divisions. So there's a concept with racism of inferiority and superiority is in that it needs to be factored into that definition. For example, I'll give you an example exactly of a terrible. This is in Seattle. This is my mother's example. So, for example, my mother grew up with a friend. This is one of her childhood friends who, my mother was close to her until she died, and I knew this woman very well. And so one of her childhood friends whose father was so racist, because this was a white lady. Her father was so racist against racial mixing that he used to say to her, the daughter, and the daughter would tell my mother and stuff like this, that he used to say to his daughter that black men have tails, basically that black people have tails. Okay, this is in Seattle, Washington. So it's not a strange phenomenon. The concept of racism, we all deal with it and are affected by it, but it shows you how extreme and what lengths people will go to in order to prevent race mixing and stuff like this, that they demonize, dehumanize, and degrade other people to such a level that they really feel that some people honestly do not feel you are human beings. There are some people, and I don't know this from the black experience. I don't know African Americans who say whites, except for the Nation of Islam in their manifesto. They made up something, and I don't even think they believe that really, their story. But generally, you don't find that level of demonization and dehumanizing of another group of people to the level that they say that they're subhuman, that they're less than. And this was what America was built on, and we're going to shortly talk about that. Secondly, so the second concept I want to talk about, the concept of cultural racism. This also needs to be defined. Cultural racism is how the dominant culture is founded upon and then shapes the society's norms, values, beliefs, and standards to validate and advantage, for example, white people in America, while oppressing people of color. Okay, so it's a type of cultural racism, a cultural superiority. We've all accepted that. We're all a part of that. We grew up here. We know this. We have, it's been since we were children, in our television, in the books that we read, and everything. Our cartoons even display that. As an African American, Bugs Bunny, all of those guys were had extreme. Look at how Bugs Bunny, those old classical cartoons of Woody Woodpecker, Bugs Bunny, all of those, what the guy who developed them, I forgot who died. But anyway, that how they portrayed Indians and African Americans and Chinese, basically all non-white people, they all needed saving. Okay, this is a part of this is white supremacy with cultural racism it's in the culture. It's presented to everyone. So as a Native American, you grow up with these concepts that you almost needed the white man to come and conquer you, put you in place, and deliver you and save you, and subject you, because this is what was everything from John Wayne in Hollywood, the great white slayer, okay, to the cartoons of Woody Woodpecker. Look at how they portrayed the African and the African American. Africans, if you look at all those old cartoons, it's in the jungle. They have bones in their noses. Their lips are like this big. My lips are big, but they're not this big. And they have the plates in them. Subhanallah, it's amazing. And these things are shown even in Saudi Arabia and other places, because they don't have these concepts. They don't look at these issues even, really. So it's a cultural racism. It's past, and it's prevalent in the dominant culture. Another important term that needs to be defined is white supremacy culture. What do I mean? This ideology, and ideologies is like a system of beliefs. A system, for example, when we talk about, I don't like to talk about ideology, especially when we talk about the methodology of Ahl Sunnah. We don't talk about ideology. But as far as other groups and sects, we would say they kind of have an ideology, because this is like a system of beliefs. It doesn't go back necessarily to divine sources. When it goes to divine sources, we don't say that it's an ideology. So those are nuances we could talk about at another time. Anyhow, this ideology, white supremacy, it's a system of beliefs, okay, asserts that white people and ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions are superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. This concept is widespread in former European colonies and even to a great extent in most Muslim countries, because many of the Muslim countries, as most of the world, has been colonized, especially in the past, the past 400 years or more, that many places were colonized, especially by Europe and European powers, and they had what's known as the scramble of Africa, where they actually just dibbed up, and had conferences and actually delegated. Okay, French, you guys get this. French, Italian, and British, you guys divide Somalia. You guys can have that. So you're going to have what became, now Hargeisa in those places, Somaliland, and you have this land, you have, all these different divisions. And a lot of the divisions in contemporary times, they come from the European scramble for power, the onslaught of colonialism. So anyhow, this ideology, a lot of it was based upon the superiority of white ideas, culture, and beliefs, that they believed that they were superior, that the Africans needed to be saved. Their old kingdoms that they have and all that history that they had and all of the riches that they had and the advancements that they had, it really needed to be saved. And it needed Christianity, and it needed, and we could do it by alcohol and do it by guns. This is one of the strategies of some of the colonial powers, which is also outside the scope of our thing. But I just want to show you how that has infected the world system. And even Muslim countries, no one escapes from that, from the onslaught and the impact of colonialism on the psyche. Okay. This concept is widespread in former European colonies, as I said. Finally, if we analyze many of the extremist white supremacist narratives as far as ideological premises, okay, we observe that they believe, so these are the more extreme ones. I believe Trump is a part of that, and we'll talk a little bit about that and so forth. But, he may not be, because he's the president, he can't really come out. He probably doesn't believe in necessarily violence. He just gives the okay for those things. So everyone has different levels, as they say, the Islamic scholars, they mention when they talk about, like, for example, Ahlul Sunnah and Ahlul Bid'ah, they say Ahlul Sunnah tafawat wa Ahlul Bid'ah tafawat. Well, likewise, Ahlul Kufr tafawat, meaning that Ahlul Sunnah, the people of the Sunnah, they have different levels depending on their knowledge and their practice and their strength in knowing the methodology of the Salaf Salih. And Ahlul Bid'ah, in their deviance, they have different levels. They are not all on the same level. We can't say such and such group is like such and such group, because they have different levels of deviance. Likewise, people have different levels of hatred and evil and disbelief. Okay, all of these things. So, with that being said, when we look at these, the extreme white supremacist narratives, they believe basically in a world in which non-whites do not exist or are subservient to whites. And the more extreme elements of those movements argue that non-whites, for example, Latino, African, or Aboriginal, Asian, are in fact what they refer to as mud people. This is you can find it in their books. For example, I think the Turner Diaries, he's a well-known white supremacist who wrote some books and so forth, and others, but they refer to them, and you probably find it in their narratives if you go to the extremist websites, and you'll find that they refer to, any non-whites as mud people. They're just mixed up and they're dirt people. They're just, we already know what that means, and should not mix and taint with white purity. So they believe in a concept of pure race. So this has always been through the inception in American, the beginning of what is known as America. This has been a part of the country's fabric. This is, when it was prior to being a country and, throughout its development. And that was what was defended and propagated at the expense of other non-white peoples. So the lesson we draw from extremist white supremacists is that the movement, whether in the colonial context or the contemporary American and European context, is to exterminate non-white peoples whom they view as subhuman or less than. We find that this system of supremacy has been manifested throughout all levels of society and thus is systemic. Okay, this is the case. This is the American case, and you'll find that this to a greater or lesser extent in the European countries as well, but especially America just has a particularly bloody and violent and extreme history. The nation's founding and mainstream white supremacy. So before we move on, I'm going to talk a little bit about black supremacy as well. But someone might wonder, well, why are you only talking about white supremacy? And why, and perhaps some people are uncomfortable with that, especially if they're white. This is not an attack on white people or any people for that matter, except it is a clarification. It is an investigation to reality, meaning the power is not in a few people on the block who, like the 5%ers or people who stem from the Nation of Islam and who have some ideas of racial hierarchy, which is very few in number. So let's say if it was a few thousand compared to millions that have been bred on this ideology. And there's also a difference, and we'll talk about that, and this has to do with power and even the concept, even in violence, that you don't find the violence. So that's why this was a topic. I think it was chosen. And again, I didn't choose the topic. It was given to me. It was chosen. I think they were trying to make this point. And so I will make that point because it's a very valid point. It's something I've always known and looked at over the years. But again, it's not to write off anyone for their racism. But plain and simple, there's a very different reality to being lynched systemically for just looking at the opposite sex. If a young black man was accused, look at Emmett Till, okay? If he was accused falsely of looking at a white woman and harassing a white man, he was hung by his neck. Excuse me, akramakum Allah, I hope there's no children here, but his testicles were cut off. And I believe they were placed in his mouth. And this was a very common way. So this is why when you see there's a motion behind this topic, this is what, as an African American, this is our history. This is well-documented history. Let's get back to where we're going. The nation's founding and mainstream white supremacy. Article 1, can you imagine that? This seems almost like something we'd read in a book, and of course you could read it in a history book. Article 1 of the Constitution says slaves are 3/5 of a person. So that's how America's began. As the concept of the state and the concept of a federation and what have you, it began, it's mabni ala hada. When we say Islam is built on 5 pillars, okay, America is built on pillars as well. The ideology in America is built on the white supremacy, because women were subjected to it, so it meant white male. And this is their foundation. It's what it's built upon. The country is built upon that. So the Article 1 of the Constitution says slaves are 3/5 of a person. And Article 7 requires states to return runaway slaves. This is America. The United States was founded on white supremacy. The Civil War ended legal white supremacy as far as the legality of it. But it continued to be enforced by Southern leaders and white militant groups. So it was still widespread. Many, even after slavery, that's a date. But there were many people who they just couldn't accept that. There was a civil war about this state power versus, and the federal government enforcing this concept, freeing their slaves, among other things. And that's why the Confederate flag is up to this date exists. People still have in their hearts an attachment to many of those ideas and this concept of being almost sovereign or sovereign state or what have you. and being able to do whatever they want. And one of the things they wanted to do was continue the legacy of white supremacy and slavery. So it was still many militant groups, and most famously, like the Ku Klux Klan. Black people were kept under control by extra legal violence, including lynching. Can you imagine, just to send a message? You know, there was always this concept, if we look in the history, of, you know, there's good blacks and there's bad blacks. And of course, they had other names for them. And the good black would be the one who's quiet, doesn't make any trouble, and, you know, is just trying to survive. And he says whatever, as they say, the house Negro and the field Negro. This was at the time during slavery. But even these concepts existed afterwards because of white supremacy. You know, you literally could be killed, raped, whatever the case may be, as there was systemic rape, widespread rape of black women during slavery and outside. I mean, you were prey. If you're going to be walking at night for any reason, you're open, especially in the countryside, even till today. Even till today, in many places, you don't do that. You don't walk on the wrong side of the line in the race, in a very racist areas, and especially as a female, you're vulnerable. And so the Ku Klux Klan, which is a terrorist organization, but not designated one. I don't believe they're designated in one. And that shows you how white supremacy defends itself. Black people were kept under control by extra legal violence, burnt alive, as I mentioned, had their private parts cut off as men. Women, they're just raped and killed, lynched as well. It goes on, and we know countless stories. If you want to know, let me tell you, which goes into what we're going to talk about anyway. For example, we talk about the Nation of Islam. We know them. If you were to read the story, if you know anything about the history of Elijah Muhammad, you know, the more or less the founder after their guy Warith Muhammad, or what is Fard Muhammad, whoever this guy was. But the history of Elijah Muhammad is known. He saw. Can you imagine that? Because this defined how he later would be, and the context of the times that they lived in down south. I think he saw something like 3. Can you imagine having like 6 or 7 brothers, and you see 3 of them taken by mobs and lynched? I mean, just one brother, one family member, even a distant cousin, to see him come in the woods and see him hanging from a tree, naked, bleeding. Can you imagine that? And how that would shape you as a human being? So, of course, all of these things are by the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of these things, nothing escapes the cone of Allah. But this is a part of the history of the development of who that man was and what later would come from him. The falsehood and whatever else he was propagating. That this shaped him. So this is the history behind that. So with the reestablishment of white supremacy in the South, the original Klan faded away. In the early 20th century, however, it was reborn as a Protestant nativist movement. The new KKK was anti-Black, but also targeted Catholics and Jews, part of a long anti-immigrant tradition in America, which is so funny because America is built on immigration. But as we see with the Trump administration and some prior to him, they were very selective in the immigrants that they wanted, of course. And, you know, it has been a rough road for all the immigrants to greater or lesser extents, you know. The second Klan was a fad that attracted millions of supporters and then rapidly faded away in the 1930s. The third Klan rose during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Whites, angry at attempts to end segregation, again put on white hoods and joined local officials. Often they were the local officials in attacking civil rights workers. So it wasn't a matter throughout history, okay? And this is why I'm saying this wasn't one event. We're not just saying, oh yeah, Black people were in slavery. Gosh, why don't you get over it? This is really the mentality of probably millions of white Americans and other immigrants. Oh, that was then. No, the history, it's a continuum. It's not just that. It'd be nice if we could just move past that. But the tangles of that, the web of that, and the supremacy, it never ended. It's still right now. Now we're seeing just some small products of it, some results right now in 2020. So then many of the officials, that means the police, that means politicians, they were Ku Klux Klansmen as well. And they attacked civil rights workers, both black and white. They were targeted for beatings, bombings, and assassinations. Okay? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 put the legal nails in segregation as far as technically, but still, even that's debatable as far as, but the legal nails, that's another issue anyway. Support for the Klan dwindled. In contemporary context, we find that while Klan popularity has dwindled, the defense of white supremacy and nationalism has not. That's why it's so strange for us when we hear the president of the United States and what is going on. There's so much violence is increasing around we've had, when Trump got elected, there was such a huge rise in violence against minorities, Islamophobia, people who, prior to Islam, African Americans and others have a history here. So many whites, old ladies coming up and driving at the gas station, go home, go back to your country. Well, shoot, we were here before you. When did you migrate here? So, you have all this hatred. There's been a rise in that nationalism. The white nationalist supremacists see Trump, he's a source of inspiration for them. That's why guys were on camera saying Heil Trump and weird stuff like this, and he doesn't denounce them. He doesn't denounce them. That's what's powerful. He sends a powerful message. He's like, shoot, we are in power. We're staying in power. I don't necessarily support them, but I'm not against them. Okay? He sends a very powerful message. At least he sends the message clearly. You don't have to have a mystery. We're divided and we're being more divided. And he openly espouses a lot of racism. So we could talk about that for days. In contrast, so now I want to talk just briefly about black supremacist theory. And as I said, black supremacist theory is often predicated on the right to use force in defense, because predominantly is manifested from a minority position. That's in a nutshell. Now, we're not going into in-depth about groups and so forth. And, like I said, the Nation of Islam is the only group that I know from my study of black history that really supported that concept. A lot of black revolutionary theory. And I'm talking about from the time of slave, from Nat Turner and many, many, many others, and even whites, John Brown and others, was not predicated on superiority, but it was defense. It's like, hey, we're not going to sit anymore. Click, click. We're not sitting anymore. And it might manifest itself in the most violent ways. They might have said, oh, you're killing our children, we're going to kill your children. So we don't agree with that. But this is how it manifests itself. You can't think you can do and push, for example, the cat in the corner and poke him, and you're going to be upset when he scratches your eyes out. That's just, it's a natural reaction, I guess you could say. So what you see, and I am open to anyone who can challenge these ideas and bring forth evidence, because I haven't seen it in my years of living, in studying and reading about African history, African American history, and other world history, even European history, that, and I'm no history expert, nor is that my major, but we see black supremacist theory, if you call it that, and there are some, like I said, the Nation is the only nation in those groups that stem from them, like the Noble Drew Ali Temple, or they probably came before the Nation, and then you had the five percenters and things like this, who say these things, they'll whatever. But you don't see the violence. There's quite a difference in its manifestation. So, for example, if we look at the Black rebellion theory from proponents of Black liberation during slavery, such as Nat Turner's and others, and throughout history, such as the movement of Marcus Garvey, and that was also about kind of Black nationalism, and he also proposed the separation of races. Okay. to later day groups such as the nation, we see that they are predominantly reacting to oppression and subjugation, genocide, forced enslavement, terrorism, and a total stripping away of human dignity and cultural repression. All of these concepts are well documented in history and through the blood, sweat, and oral history of African Americans. The history itself, I cannot begin to do justice to by mentioning here. However, our history is well documented, and I feel confident in saying that the combined repression of what has taken place for the Palestinians at the hand of the Zionists and their supporters, the internment of Japanese in America, the whole-scale slaughtering of the Jews, pales in comparison to the indignity and tyranny inflicted upon the African American throughout history in America. And that's something, it's debatable. Moreover, the last two peoples I mentioned, the Jews and the Japanese, have actually received reparations to help compensate for their suffering, and the African American has only received further church bombings, shootings, the indignity of a denial of their suffering in mainstream political realm, and in fact, a mocking of their struggles and what it means to be Black in America. That's really our reparations. That's what we received as a compensation as a people. Wallahu musta'an. The final aspect of this topic I wanted to highlight is the negative import of racism and supremacy and some of its effects upon our Muslim community. In this section, I will highlight many of the experiences I've witnessed and from personal experience of others with regards to the internal racism that should be addressed in the Muslim community. So I'm going to give you some examples here. So I recall, this is true. I recall a man I used to work with in Hail, because that was the first place I went to in Saudi Arabia, who mentioned he was interested in Islam. This was an African American. He said until he was with one of our students, because we used to teach at the college there. He was with one of our students as they drove home from the college. It was a Saudi student, very tribal, because that place was very tribal in the Hail, Shemri and otherwise, Wanazi, Harbi. And he said, and the student said, "Teacher, look at those animals." They were driving in the car close to our apartments. "Teacher, look at those animals." He replied that he didn't see what he was talking to because they were, driving by the park, Hadiqat Zaytun. He then pointed to the Bengali street cleaners cleaning the park. He recounted to me that if this is how Muslims treat their own brothers, then I have no interest in this religion. So I spent my remainder of time with him saying, that's not Islam, Islam. If it was bottom line is that was enough for him. I'm not interested in that religion. It's no different than the other things, because this is how you guys treat each other. And a lot of people have witnessed this. I know a close Habib, he was about to roll up, and he's not a sit and be quiet type of person. And he was about to put his fist through the mouth of some of those Saudis and others who were oppressing some of our, I think, Indian or Pakistani brothers, or the Pakistanis usually don't take that because they're usually pretty strong, but some of the Indians and Filipinos and others and Bengalis tend to be weaker and in a weaker position and not as physically strong. So he was about to roll up some of those Saudis because of that. And this is what he witnessed in his making Umrah and stuff. Let me give you some other examples. I also recall how being in the company of scholars, and one of them jokingly stated that I wanted to marry from the Sheikh's tribe. He responded that his tribe would not marry a Black man or a Black person. This hurt me. Here you're sitting with Mashayikh, scholars. These scholars of Ahl Sunnah, Salafi scholars that I love even to today. But with the way the Sheikh said that, it just like, whoa, boom, it hit me in the chest. It made me think. I wanted to respond from Jahiliyyah. I was going to say, Sheikh, you don't see how your girls are peeping me, giving me the game. Every time I walk on the street, all these girls out here and your thing. This is how I felt. I was like, man, I felt like lashing back. But no, of course, that wasn't the appropriate thing to do. But it's just, it shows you. But that hurt. It did kind of hurt because I'm thinking we're all the same. We're, brothers here. I'm kicking it with the Sheikh. We're eating at his house, it's at his house. And, subhanAllah. So the concept of racism and the tribalism and stuff is so prevalent in our Muslim community. It doesn't escape. We can't say, be Muslim and racism's finished. No. And this is where I'm giving you some of the examples of what we need to deal with. because I think our audience is, the few people that are here are Muslim, probably. I also recall the many times we were told that real Americans are white. So many brothers I've had this discussion with. Crazy. This is a real story. This happened in Medina. All my stories are real. A white brother came to visit some of the African-American brothers working at a language center in Medina, Shari Sultana, close to Jama Islamiyya, like very close to the Islamic University of Medina. The Tunisian manager, literally, when he saw the white brother come to the entrance of the door, and my man was the one who related this to me, he said, he almost dropped his pen and his book. He said, now that is a real American. And he offered the brother a job instantly, who had no qualifications nor an intent for employment, for a job on the spot, to give him a job. Hey, please come. And I recall the same brother, the white brother, being asked countless times if he was a Muslim, even while he was in Masjid al-Haram in Mecca. These examples illustrate how the concept of supremacy has wreaked havoc upon the Muslim psyche, and racism. The concepts of superiority and racism is so, and this isn't, a lot of us want to blame just colonialism, just another phase. We had this during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and prior to that, they had, of course, tribalism and tribal wars, and they had racism. That's why the Prophet ﷺ had to yu'allij hadha. He had to give the medicine by saying that there's no difference between Arab and non-Arab, black and white, and so on and so forth. And why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that he created the nation tribes, lita'arafu, so that we know one another. That we know one another. And I'm going to tell you why that's important at the very end. So also, another example similar to this, I can recall also, this was in Ohio, okay? So these are all very religious people, very tribal. And I said to the assistant dean of the college, I remember, because they loved me because I was an American, and, and I was short-thawed. They just couldn't imagine, especially in a place like Ohio back then. So I was well known and famous really throughout the whole Ohio city. So I remember talking to the mudir, because I was like, at that stage, I was new to Saudi Arabia, and I was thinking about hijrah. I was like, I want to make hijrah. He said, no, when we're finished with you, you need to go back to your country. No, we don't, you guys can't, this isn't about hijrah. You're doing a job here. And so I remember saying to him, he said to me once, he said, Khalid, kayfa unsuriya fi America? He said, how is racism in America? And I reacted so emotional and strong, as I am an emotional person. I said, subhanallah. I said, wallahi, ma wajadtu unsuriya mithlakum. I said, wallahi, by Allah, I haven't experienced racism like I experienced it with you. And he was shocked. He sat back. He said, no way. How is that? And I said, listen, let me give you an example. If one of our brothers from Bangladesh, from Ahl Sunnah, beautiful beard, handsome, on the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he wanted to marry a Shamriya, from your tribe. How would you feel about that? Well, no, I said, and I said, but if a Shemri, and he's the most wicked, he doesn't pray, he smokes, he does every kind of wicked sin, he's got action just for the tribe. Oh yeah, well, I said, yeah, I said, I don't generally experience that in America, and I wasn't raised that way. Another example, and I can think of countless, this is just in Saudi Arabia, but I'm going to wrap it up very shortly, so be patient. I recall a dark-skinned brother who wanted to marry an Asian sister. This is in America. I also know an Afro-Caribbean black brother from Canada, who was a good friend of mine. We were in Yemen together, and he got in almost a fight this is in Saudi Arabia, because the head, the mudir, the manager of the police department, this was in the police, or it was in the Jawazat, in the passports office, said, they got in something, and he called him an abd. He said, slave, you black slave kind of thing. My man is a big boy too. And he wanted to roll on them, but alhamdulillah, I'm glad he didn't. He didn't go to jail for that. And we have many stories. I have many stories like that I've seen in Yemen, Ramadan, the first day of Ramadan, the last time I was in Yemen. First, we landed in Sana'a. I was going to Aden, and I was getting a taxi. Now the guy was late, had me all messed up, and he wanted to charge me extra for almost making me miss my flight. And I had all these bags. He said, look at your bags. Look at what they did to my car. And it was the first day of Ramadan, so I'm fasting. And look at your bag. I want more money. And I said, SubhanAllah, we agreed. You almost made me late. You lost your way to the airport. When I got all my bags and I was struggling, sweating, first day of Ramadan, scared I'm going to miss my flight. Tons of bags. Throw it on the ground. And he said to me, when he drove away, he said, you're the son of a black mother. This is the first day of Ramadan. I said, yeah, I am. I said, and I don't know if I called him a son of a dog. I don't remember. I think I might have restrained it because it was Ramadan, but I was hot. And it shows you this is the reality of what we deal with in the world. And I'm saying we as human beings, I'm not saying just as black people, but as human beings, you find this disease. It's sick. Here's an example getting back to America and Seattle specifically. I recall a very dark-skinned brother who wanted to marry an Asian sister, whose brother was very close to him. When the sister accepted and relayed the message to the family, the same brother, because he was friends with this brother from this particular group of Asians, they were very close, in the street and, kicking and playing football, whatever they did, enjoying one another. He said to his sister, I will never let you marry that in or a in, So it shows how that, it's cool. We can kick and we can eat a little bit together, but you're crossing the line. You want to marry from us. And they're immigrants, so they carry their own racism and baggage and their own concepts. Also what has been constructed for them and what they witness. It all forms who we are as people and the hatred that we learn. I also reflect on several interracial marriages that ended with white wives saying, you act too black. This is one scenario I know. Or calling the husband the N-word. That's another scenario I know. Those are two separate occasions I know personally. We also are called upon to reflect upon the Arab brother. This is really the last story, I believe, who came to the imam. This, I think, this was back east, and this is one of the imams was relating this, and said, be careful of them. He just came up to the imam, and the imam didn't even know. And he said, be careful of them. So the imam said, who? What are you talking about? He said, blacks, because 10 years ago, 2 black guys broke into our masjid and stole the sadaqah box. This illustrates that even in the houses of Allah, we are not safe from racial indignities and prejudices. I share these experiences, and there are countless others. So don't think this is, oh yeah, you just had a few experiences. I just gave you about 10 that I personally witnessed, and I probably mention 100 or 1,000 myself. Meaning that this is widespread, these issues. But I wanted to give you some real issues that I know of to make it more potent and valid, I guess. I share these experiences and countless others, which are far worse, to show the need to address these controversial topics of race, supremacy, and how ignorance can ultimately define how we relate to one another and how we interact or choose not to interact with one another. I believe our way forward is by knowledge of one another, empathy, recognizing the strength of one another, and being brothers as the religion and intellect dictates. So this is not, I didn't want to just bring a bunch of adillah. We already know. We know all the evidences, and I've been doing it for years. So if you want the evidences, just go back to my YouTube. You'll find countless lectures about Muslims being brothers and all those things. We know this. But as far as practicing, it's very difficult for a lot of us to let those things go. And I think, as I just mentioned, as just going to one small part of the ayah, which is so important, which has so much import, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that I created you in nations and tribes to know one another, to know one another. Because when you know one another, that requires mixing. When you get to know one another, this is what breaks down barriers. When someone says, no, I know. I've had people prior to being a Muslim. I remember one white guy, and it just threw me off because I wasn't one who was raised really that conscious of race like that, okay? I'm black, come from a black family. We live now, predominantly white area or what have you, and now that's changed. But for me, race wasn't a big deal, but I remember being on a job site once, a construction job. I can remember many stories with that. But I remember working with this white guy. We're doing a job, and he was actually in charge. He was older. he had experience. So it was just me and him on the job site, and we were just basically doing labor, digging out something and preparing it for other work. And he said something like, "I like you." It just threw me off guard because, we were working together, we're sweating together, bleeding together, whatever. And he says, "I like you." And I said, "Okay." And he said something like, "You're a good nigger." I was like, I didn't even know what to say. It just floored me. He said, "I've never met one," or something like, it just out of the blue. For me, I was like, oh yeah, this is a human being I'm working with. We're doing a job. This guy comes out with this. And I've had many instances like that just floored me because they were on a whole different planet because of their ignorance. That's what it comes down to. It comes to ignorance. His ignorance in context, his stereotypes of what black people, who they are, and obviously his ignorance of the own history of what has produced who's to blame for the hate that hate made, as they say, the whole history. So we don't want, the purpose is not to make people feel guilty or anything, but the purpose is, this is education. That's why I went through this. Normally my lectures are not like this and not even about these sensitive topics. But it's so important if we're going to heal and go forward that we have an idea that who those brothers are and sisters that are in the masjid with you, because they're predominantly, as far as the indigenous Muslims, it's predominantly African American, although there's others, there's Hispanics and and Latinos, and there of course white brothers and sisters, but the masses of those communities in America, they were established by African Americans. They were the ones more inclined towards Islam. So we need to educate ourselves about who your brothers and sisters are and why, unfortunately, we're in the state that we are, at least some of the reasons, and to give it a background. We ask Allah the Almighty to accept our good and forgive our evil. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad. If there are any comments, so someone keeps putting about the black Hebrew Israelites. Yeah, that's another group, another manifestation. Again, that's minor. I don't know of any situations, and I bet if we documented as far as them committing violence against whites and hanging whites, and so I don't know of it. So that's why I was making the point, and part of the point that they wanted to illustrate by making this lecture was to show that the black supremacy, in its few manifestations really, is a reaction to the white supremacy, and it's not violent. It's generally about defense. When you see, you have now the new Black Panther Party, they're called. And the Black Panther Party was not, people have a weird concept of that, and they hate them, but they were really a social movement, a group. They were a reaction against police violence. They were not on black supremacy theory because they worked with white liberals. They worked with homosexuals. They worked kind of like the Black Lives Matters movement and stuff like this. So they were not, as the people feared them because they're black men with guns. That's fearful. Still, like yesterday, I went for a walk yesterday, okay, in the park around here. I was, we were raised around here. I feel like this is my place. But every time I come into white ladies, they always feel uncomfortable. And when I was a youngster, no. But now that I'm a man, I'm an adult man, they instantly kind of get a little, ooh, what's this black guy? There's not many other people in this park. He's walking around the park. I'm always conscious of that. I was never conscious of that. And it's not that I'm paranoid, but it's unfortunate reality. You can see it in their face. I was going to go in the woods. I said, but I might run across a white lady. I don't want to be in an uncomfortable situation or something else. So I just decided to take my laps around there. But I was like, I'm not going to let them control me. Shoot, I was here first. There's also some Yahud around here I've seen, especially Russians and stuff like this. And you can see that they have a weird, they look at you weird. I'm like, shoot, dude, you just migrated here. My blood was here. I was here in this park when it was woods, when we was having sword fights and chasing flying squirrels, man. What are you talking about? So anyhow, so I'm going to open this up really quickly to if there's any comments or questions, because that's what I wanted it to be. I'm sorry that it took so long, but it is an important topic. And I'm glad we got a chance to even deal with it anyway, to speak about it. It's very important. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I see there's no comments, which is unfortunate. And anyhow, I think we'll go because I do want to try to make the Jumu'ah prayer, bi'idhnillah ta'ala, which will actually be the first one for me since this COVID. And we ask Allah Azza wa Jal, the Almighty, to accept our good and forgive our evil. Anything I said that was correct was from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anything I said that was incorrect was from myself and the shaitan. And again, I'm a little bit disappointed that there isn't any comments about this. What do you think of a weekly podcast as Black Muslims speaking about racism in the Muslim community? Like I said, these issues need to be, but I think it's more important that there's engagement, that the communities themselves, because the immigrant communities aren't going anywhere and we're not going anywhere. We have to realize we're brothers. So we need to be frank in our discussion. So everyone needs to be included in that. And it should be a discussion and not a clash of civilizations or a blame or anything like this. We need to have, because the bottom line is, at the end of the day, we're still Muslims. The Muslims are brothers. Okay, so I think there is, there's that need for that cooperation. Someone said, what should one's stance be as a Black Muslim regarding these times going on? That's a very broad question. But again, like I said, as far as the race issue, I believe we need to know one another. We need to begin to have these frank discussions. We need to, have empathy for one another and begin to understand. We, as African Americans, I really believe we need to build. And this actually goes back because it's a reality. No one's going to take care of us. I don't think it's going to change. They're not going to let us be imams in the masjid. There's going to be, I believe some of this will actually divide. And once the hype goes down, things will go back to normal. You'll go to the masjid and it's a predominantly Pakistani masjid, and they'll let you know that you can pray here, but you don't really have a real stake there. You're not really, I don't feel like I'm a part of hardly any of these communities. That's why I'm going to go to a very far community that I love that's probably predominantly Somali, but it's also the admin is Ethiopian, Afghani, and those are my genuine brothers. That's the most comfortable community I feel here in Seattle is the SeaTac Masjid, was known as the SeaTac Masjid. But then there's also some other communities that are more, but anyhow, so the stance in general is we also need to take responsibility for our own ills. No one's going to do it. So we need to be organized. We need to start giving dawah to non-Muslims, because we need to increase the numbers, because most of the immigrant communities, they immigrated for dunya. I don't think there's hardly any people, you could probably count them on their hand, that immigrated to America because they want to give dawah. Okay. They immigrated for the dunya, and that's between them and their Lord subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. And alhamdulillah, and they've contributed. We can't nullify the contributions. We wouldn't have these masajid if it was, or some of these masajid and a lot of masajid, if it wasn't for the contribution and the khair. So we don't want it to be us against them. Those are our brothers and sisters. But I do honestly believe that we need to, and this kind of is in light of, because I used to study the theories, Marcus Garvey, W. Du Bois, Malcolm X, Booker T. Washington, and I'm kind of the book guy. I believe in the theory of, education, because we need to educate our youth as well. We need to get our kids out of the streets. We need to educate them. We need to build our communities. We need to show that we can cooperate amongst ourselves based on the book and the sunnah and come to the table in strengthened as men. For example, when there's a Eid or when there's something, we need to be able to show that, hey, we're competent and we can come to the table too and contribute. We're not just going to be your security. Okay. And this is it's been like that too long. And another example, or one thing I see is some of the communities, some of the people in the communities are realizing this. For example, my experience more recently, prior to COVID and after COVID, I had several brothers appeal to me. They said, Khalid, you need to be here, teach. Why don't you be the imam? They're telling me to be the imam. Why? Because they said, we know we got it wrong. And this came from an Indonesian. It came from a Cham, which is Cambodian. It came from could be Cambodian, Vietnamese. I don't know enough about the Kingdom of Champa, also several Somalis, and they all agreed. They said, "Man, what are you doing?" And also a brother who's from West Africa. So several, they're pushing me. They're like, "No," they say, "You understand the people, you understand the culture, you have the language. We realized we didn't get it right. We lost our youth, and now here we are." So there is people waking up and realizing that we can't, that as African Americans and others, we can't be excluded anymore. We need to be at the table, because their youth identify more with us than they identify with their own elders. The Somali youth don't even understand Somali on that high level to understand lectures in Somali. You can't still come to America, be the imam and the sheikh, and you're delivering in Somali or Oromo or Tigray. That's not sufficient when you're in America. America's English is the first language. You need to be up on it. Especially you're a Muslim and you're a da'i ilallah. So it's very important. So sorry to get off on a tangent, but anyway, we have a lot of work to do. But I really believe we've got to organize and start doing programs, start giving our youth options, start raising our communities and raising our youth and looking after our youth and giving them options, teaching them to love Islam so they love seeking knowledge. I like what the little bit that I follow and see of our brothers in the Imam Muslim Family Center. This is something I have the idea, and we're talking about it, me and some brothers here in Seattle. But, Seattle is so different. We don't have the numbers. We don't have we don't have many of the things, and a different mentality. But I'm glad to see those brothers, and I support them, at least in dua. And if I financially could, I would. And if I could physically, I would. Any way that I could, because those kind of things, we need that. And we need to show that we can handle our business as well and do positive programs and bring something positive and strength to the table. So I believe we have to really raise up our communities and take things to a whole nother level in many ways, with secular knowledge, with Islamic knowledge, with many, many things, and raising our children. Those are just some of the things, I guess. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us and grant us success. في الدنيا والآخرة وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.